everyone. I'm very honored to be here to share and to present my PhD topic to you. So as we can see on the screen on the first slide, so it's about the prediction and quantification of L2 English listener response through semi-supervised learning via big data corpora. And it can be a little bit confused, right? So in this talk, I will share how I designed this study and how to incorporate the big data into the language model training, and why should we focus so much on the feature of listener response with the second language learning process. So here's a little bit of self-introduction. So I'm Rena Gao. I'm a first-year PhD student in two faculties because I have supervisors from both of the two faculties, and also due to the nature of my study, it's called interdisciplinary. I want to know how many second language speakers of English are here in the conference today? Oh, you think you guess? That's a quite large population, right? So there's a quite famous quote from Fellini that a different language is a different version of life. Because we know if we speak different languages, we have different ideologies, we have different perspectives of life. But sometimes the different languages can also create barriers and difficulties in the mutual understanding in social interactions. So the structure of today's talk and share will be listed as in the slide. So first, I will go briefly into the theoretical background of the study. So what is big data, and how should we incorporate big data in the language model training? And thank you, Will. And what is listener response? Why listener response matters so much, and why it actually functions so importantly in the human communications in the dialogue? And what do we know about cross-lingual listener response? And how should we actually predict the listener response labels in through the language model output in the human dialogue conversations? And then I will briefly introduce the research gaps and aims to let you know, what's the innovation point of the study? And also the methodology of the study. The first part is the language model design, and second part is the investigation on the development of second language listener response. That's quite the linguistic part, and the first part is quite the NLP part. And I'll also show you the study design and also some preliminary findings and proposed outcomes. Also, if we still have time, we can go to the timeline of the research project for now. Okay, let me raise a question. So is there anyone who are super familiar with the big data, and why we call big data as the big data, not like the small data or the other data? That's a good question, right? So actually we encounter a lot of data every day in our life simply with the language big data. For example, we all have social medias. So we'll put some comments, we'll give some posts on the social media. So every time, that's a quite live process. So during the live interactions, we create a huge amount of posts and comments in the social media, in the internet. So that's quite large. And also, for example, in a lot of live scenarios, if we want to seek for advice, if we want to seek for some customer service, for example, for Telstra or for Vodafone, we will check through the chat box for customer service in the real-time action. And in that case, every time you give some response to a chat box, to this kind of online customer service, you're actually creating a data into this kind of language big data. And also, every time, every day, every moment in the world, we have millions of word emojis and also voice messages every day. So generally speaking, what is big data? So big data actually means a data set that is large in terms of volume and is more complex because that's really large, definitely. And also that's quite complex because it's not related or not limited just to multimodal, not just limited to single modal features, but also related to multimodal features like pictures or emojis, not just related to text itself. And also big data therefore includes all measures that make it possible to collect, to process, and also to analyze the amount of data. Okay, so after we know and give a little bit definition of big data, and let's take another concept into the study. So what is listener response in language big data, and why this concept is so important in the dialogue data? I think a lot of us have experience during our social interactions. We may pause, or we may have some manner, raising in the tone to actually want to ensure our listeners, which is our interlocutors, do understand our intentions or do understand the information we provide to them as a speaker. So generally, Jefferson actually defines listener response as the tokens that listeners provide in talk to show attitudes and intentions. For example, we can use and this kind of simple tokens to show we do understand the intentions of the speakers in talk. And the functions of listener response is also crucial in the study because it actually motivates the study. So listener response actually helps the speakers to maintain the conversation flow smoothly between all parties in communication. Because if we don't receive any feedbacks from the other parties in the talk, we don't know whether they really understand our information or not. So it's hard for us to continue our talk in a collaborative sense. So, and it also helps interlocutors to understand and to check the information in dialogue. It actually not just helping the listeners to express their attitude, to express their intentions, but it also helps speakers to ensure their understanding of the information in the talk. And some of the common tokens like yeah and right, are you serious? These are kind of quite common tokens in listener response. But sometimes listener response can also be expressed in some non-verbal ways. For example, does anyone know what this represents in the Italians? Yeah, that's a quite typical gesture as the listener response function in Italian communication. So we have a joke, like if you just grab the hand of the Italian people, or they don't know how to talk, because that's a quite important way to express their listener response in the collaborative social talk. So why are we looking at these features in the language data instead of other features? For example, not just looking at the text classifications, not just looking at the dialogue acts. Why should we looking at the listener response, especially with a special population here? Why we choose the population as the second language speakers of English? Because I think we all have this kind of shared experience as the second language speaker of English, that sometimes we do suffer or do under the impact of our first language. For example, in different social contexts or in different cultural ideologies, we have different ways and different patterns to express our understanding in the social talks. So sometimes the first language do impact a lot with the listener response in talk. And because different cultures also influence the pattern, so definitely the second language speakers of English have a really different pattern compared with the native speakers, which actually generate a very interesting data set in the big data. And the third thing is because this kind of barriers in understanding can sometimes create misunderstanding in communication, especially with listener response, because listeners' response is more live in communications. If we're looking at a transcript of a talk, we can realize a different population of speakers, they have a different pattern of listener response, even we are just simply looking in the text transcriptions. So in here, we want to achieve a better mutual understanding in communications for the second language speakers. But the challenges still lies here in the research compared with the previous studies. Because first is that the data sets in the previous study is quite limited because a lot of studies in listener response was mainly laid in linguistic perspective. So the linguistic approach doing that was just to recruiting human participants and let the annotators do the study. But the problem with that, the popular representation is not enough. So we say due to the time frame of a PhD project, just a 3-year or 4-year, we cannot include too many participants in that, which actually limits the size of the data and actually limits the population representation in all to represent such a big population. So in that way, we want to use a big data to represent more comprehensible population and to see, okay, what can we get the pattern outcome from a language model prediction. So in here, this study was actually divided into 2 studies. So the first part is about the live interactions. So in this part, we actually define the different functions of listener response. For example, like agreement, or sometimes in a social talk, if we agree with what the speaker said, we can use some tokens to show our agreement. And similarly, like assessment, questioning, or continuing, these kind of tokens can actually function to show the intention of the listener. So in this part, we actually define the coding scheme and we define the label of listener response in the data. So, and we also set the data in different settings, for example, in classroom interactions and also in the medical consultations. So these kind of settings can actually generate more richer data compared with the single settings, and it can actually give us more background knowledge in different domains. Okay, so the second part of the study was related to some engineering stuff. So this part, we actually want to use a big data corpus with full annotations and reliable transcriptions to train the language model, which related to machine learning. I will just briefly present how we got the outcome from the current data. And also, some of the data was also the outcome from the speech recognition outcome in different settings. For example, one of the very interesting data set we used was from Alishell. So Alishell is basically a speech recognition data set from Alibaba, which gives a huge data input from a meeting settings. Okay, so the study was divided into two stages, and how we actually designed the study process by process. So here, this study currently, because I'm still in my first year and we're still completing all the framework here. But for currently, during the first year, we are just doing the full process. So the first process is about the language model building and training it with the data corpus. And I will also show you what corpus we use to train the model. And also the second stage is about collecting the data from the live scenarios. For example, we're also recruiting some human participants and to see how our model actually perform on a more smaller data set, to see the model performance and to do some evaluation matrix on that. And we'll also recruit some annotators to give some labels on that, because the reason why we want to input or incorporate big data into this kind of study was because to annotate the labels on the big data is very time-consuming and labor-causing. So we want to improve that by introducing the semi-learning approach, or semi-supervised learning approach. So in that case, we will recruit the annotator, just do 25% of the data labeling, and the rest of that we will also use the unsupervised learning to see how the model performs. So the third step is to detecting the performance on the collected data. So the collected data was relatively small compared with the training data. So another challenging and innovation point of the study was to transfer the learning outcome from big data to a more smaller data sets. So the fourth step and also the last step is to compare on the development of the listener response, because all the populations we are looking at was the second language speakers. So we are also curious from the linguistic perspective that how this kind of listeners from their second language ability actually improves based on our language model prediction outcome. For example, did they become more active listener during their different stages of study abroad? Whether they improved their patterns or whether they changed their patterns in that. Okay, so that's one part of the experiment in my first year. So we actually use the switchboard dialogue corpus to train that. And as we can see from the table there, so the data is quite large and the labels are quite rich. And some of the common functions of listener response can be labeled as, for example, like statements, agreement, greeting, question, apology, or other intentions. But other intentions, the label was not that sufficient enough, so we'll just put other in there. But as we can see from the results here, so if we actually got the first intention, and then we can predict the function of next label in our data. So that's quite, the performance of the model right now is not so bad, I can say. So actually, one innovation point here is that we train our model through the switchboard data, and then we actually see the performance from a relatively more smaller recording. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see that's interaction recording from 2 second language speakers. And in here, if we're listening to that.
Yeah, everybody together, I think. But also the top managers, because they have to know each other too, because you have top managers from the one company and top managers from the other company, and they have to get along also, because otherwise you're going to have problems in your top management. And
I agree.
Then
yeah, so it's quite obvious that we can notice there's one listener response from the male speaker that he showed his agreement to the female speaker. So our model performance is, if we got the transcription of the talk, we can actually predict the label is like agreement to the male speaker. Yeah. So that's basically all the framework and the progress for the project right now. So thanks everyone for listening.